let that go. It's okay that you're a human. It's okay that you're struggling with this.
And the good news is that it's very treatable, and there's hope for living a life free of OCD, living in the freedom that God has for you. Welcome to Tea with Dymphna. I'm Elizabeth.
And I'm Lauren, and we are Catholic psychotherapists who work in private practices. Grab a mug of your favorite drink and join us. We are going to talk today about scrupulosity.
So Lauren, tell us more about what is OCD?
So OCD is a anxiety disorder. It's a subcategory of anxiety. And there are multiple subcategories of OCD, one of which is scrupulosity, but there can be a number of things: illness anxiety, hoarding, you can have contamination fears. There are multiple. There's pedophilia OCD. There are a number of things. Often intrusive thoughts and organization are things that are associated. But scrupulosity is specific to religious fear. So it's a way that your anxiety kind of takes over, and you can become very rigid and ritualistic about your faith, and it takes over and it becomes a monster of its own.
Can you give some examples? Like, what have you seen in your own practice of someone with scrupulosity? Like, how would they know that they have it? What are some of the symptoms and telltale signs?
So overall anxiety about hell, like going to hell, is a really, really big indicator. Like, ultimately, OCD is when a person begins to ritualize aspects of their life, and they think that if they don't do these things, some horrible thing will happen, and they associate any compulsions that they have with relief from their anxiety. So their brain will generate like, okay, you have to pray this rosary, and if you don't pray this rosary, then your mom is going to die, or you're going to go to hell, or someone that you love is going to go to hell. And so that's indicated by like placing ultimate importance on these small ritualistic types of things. So with intrusive thoughts, one of the things that people have observed is that it doesn't seem like there are ritualistic behaviors, but there actually are. So sometimes people will get like an intrusive thought about, like, I don't know, something that they deem as sinful. And what they'll do is they'll say like an internal prayer. So there might not seem like there's a compulsion, but there really is a compulsion. The obsession is, I don't want to go to hell, or I don't want my loved ones to go to hell. The compulsion is ritualistic prayer, and, other ritualistic behaviors. Like confession is one.
Yeah, that's actually something that I see a lot in my practice. Catholics who come to me and they tell me they go to confession, and they leave confession, and instead of feeling relief and closer to God, they feel like, what if I didn't say it correctly? What if I forgot to say something? What if I didn't explain it correctly? What if through my failure of doing the right kind of confession, actually did not receive forgiveness of my sins, and therefore I'm not forgiven, I'll go to hell. And then what happens is, in order for them to feel at peace and not anxious, their OCD tells them, you have to go to confession again. You have to do it again. And then they go again, that kind of like ritualistic, like doing it again. And then they leave and they still feel anxious. Yeah. And usually it gets worse the more they comply with that inner urge of, you have to do it again. It just didn't sit right. And what's at the core of that is the inability to tolerate uncertainty. I mean, there is a level of faith, right? Like, I trust that my sins are forgiven, but the OCD will come in and say, but what if, right?
Yeah.
What if you missed something? What if you didn't do it correctly? Well, the priest said he forgave you, but what if you didn't say everything and that one thing wasn't forgiven? Or even, what if you forgot a big mortal sin? That's something I see it too. What if you committed a mortal sin, like on Sundays, receiving communion? What if I committed a mortal sin? You shouldn't receive communion. And the logical part would be like, well, I mean, obviously, right? If you committed a mortal sin, you would know.
Right.
You would know, otherwise it's not a mortal sin. But they're like, but what if you forgot? What if? And then you will receive communion in a state of mortal sin, and that's a terrible sin. Or this, again, I have to go to confession because else what if I die now? What if I forgot? Or what if I missed the fact that I just committed a mortal sin? And they will think about it and obsess about it and go through the whole week and try to remember. And the more they think it through, right? The idea is that if I just think about it long enough, I will feel at peace. If I just say the right confession, I will feel okay. But the problem is that never happens. At least, right, in my experience, that just never happens. Because the more we comply with OCD and the scrupulosity, the stronger it gets. Because we're telling our brain, this is relevant, this is a true fear. And so we don't get that feeling of relief by complying.
Yeah, absolutely. I've seen the same thing. And that's really all anxiety. When you give in to anxiety, I always say it's a bully. And it will bully you your entire life until you stand up to it, which is why a really common like therapeutic recommendation is exposure response therapy, which is essentially exposing yourself to your fears. People do like exposure ladders and all kinds of things in order to begin to tolerate things that are uncomfortable. That's a key component to solving OCD.
What would you tell your clients as they're exposing themselves to the trigger? And can you give an example? Like, what would that look like to expose yourself to such anxiety? And then what would you tell them? Like, what should they do as they're sitting in that discomfort?
Yeah. Right now, all the exposure things that I'm thinking of are not religious. So I might use a non-scrupulous example, but an example that I've used for just working with OCD in the past. So let's say someone has an obsession with checking. So checking means that's a subcategory of OCD. That means perhaps you consistently check doors. What I would have someone do is we would build an exposure ladder, and an exposure ladder is from 0 to 10. What are behaviors that feel like 0 being this is like tolerable, completely tolerable. So something that's completely tolerable for a door checker is checking the door. Like whenever I feel like I need to, I go and check to make sure that the door is locked. A 1 might be I wait 30 seconds before I go and check the door. A 2 might be I have to go at least 2 hours without checking the door. When you work your way up to 10, it's when I have a compulsion to check the door, I remind myself I've already checked the door and I let it go. And I address the inner thought that like, usually people's checking compulsions, they don't realize it, but they're connected to some innate fear. And they believe if I do this, I'm like, it can be as grand as like, I'm saving my mom's life. Like it can really be that grandiose. And so the idea is like, that is not realistic. And it's not like people with OCD are psychotic or something. It's not like they know that sounds irrational, but they also have this strong inner anxiety that's compelling them to do it. So yeah, you just resist it. You acknowledge like, this makes me uncomfortable. But in time, I will grow less and less uncomfortable with this. And in fact, it will have less of a hold on me over time because I'm proving to myself that this actually has no connection to reality.
Yeah, I love that ladder, increasing the amount that we wait.
Yeah.
And to be clear, as you were saying, what was number 1? It was waiting 30 seconds. That, for somebody who really struggles with scrupulosity and OCD, 30 seconds can feel really long.
Yeah.
And as we wait and not check and not do the ritual or not go back to confession, those 30 seconds feel very hard, right? And the discomfort is very, very great. And it feels as if we're being like reckless, right? Because our OCD might say like, if you don't comply now, something bad will happen. Like you need to do this now. So that sense of urgency is typically a pretty good telltale sign that you're dealing with scrupulosity, OCD. If you can't wait 30 seconds, if you can't wait half hour, 2 hours, if waiting 2 hours seems reckless and very dangerous, that could be a telltale sign. Because really, if you think about it, there are very few things in this life that are like so urgent that you can't wait 30 seconds or 30 minutes. And if your OCD is telling you, you need to think through your past week and see if this was a mortal sin, or like if you can't wait, if your OCD is telling you if you wait, that's very dangerous, then it's probably OCD. And then as we sit in that discomfort, like you were saying, we sit in that discomfort and we increase our tolerance for uncertainty. And we're giving our brains the feedback that I don't actually have to do anything about it. I do not need to respond. And you know how they say, don't just stand there, do something? I always tell my clients, don't just do something, stand there. Right, yeah. So what you want to do when you have those urges is to not respond. Nothing, right? And I like to give my clients the phrase to use, I'm not going to answer that question. My clients, my OCD clients, hear me say that all the time. I'm not going to answer the question. But what if you committed a mortal sin? I'm not going to answer the question. But what if you die in the next minute and you'll go to hell? I'm not going to answer the question. As we go through that, you can see that is going to feel very reckless. And so I always tell my clients, yes, you need to be, it's going to feel very reckless. And as you resist, like you were saying, Lauren, the discomfort rises and rises. That's how you know you're doing it right. You have to let the discomfort rise. You gotta have to like sit in it. As hard as that is, I know it's so hard, right? Like the things that we're kind of like talking about, like they sound simple, but when you're actually doing them, they're so hard,
so
right?
Painful.
Really, really painful, very anxiety inducing, because our brain is really convinced that this is something we need to, right? It's like our whole like inner alarm system is going off and it's telling us danger, danger, danger. And here we are being like, I'm not going to do anything. And that's really hard, but that's really the only way to eventually get the OCD to decrease.
So one of the things that I like think about as we're talking about this is, what would you say to somebody who, if they're listening to this, or if you had a patient walk in and they, as you began to like talk about like, this is what OCD is, this is like the treatment for OCD, and their inner anxiety begins to mount as they hear you say things like, actually, I'm going to have you not go to confession when you're not certain that you've committed a mortal sin. And initially their inner response is potentially going to be something like, I need to protect myself from this person who's saying like potentially sacrilegious stuff, or like, what would be your response? How would you respond to something like that?
That's a really good question. Well, typically when I have someone walk into my practice with OCD, scrupulosity, I typically start by taking at least like a full session explaining to them what OCD is, like kind of like longer than what we're doing here. Really like explaining what we know about OCD, how it works, how it affects the brain, and explaining the CBT, which stands for cognitive behavioral therapy. That's like what I use for OCD. The CBT tools and skills, I like explain it to them. And so just so they understand. Most of my patients, when I explain it to them, most of them, at least so far, have said, that makes a lot of sense. Most of them do say, oh my gosh, that sounds really hard, right? And so what I do is I empathize with them and I say, I know it's really hard, right? It's kind of unfair. Like when you kind of, when you start using these tools, you don't start at like level 1 and you work your way up. You start like level 10. You start with like, at the beginning, it's going to be the hardest. So it is hard. And, but yes, I invite that kind of resistance that you were kind of alluring to, like people do sometimes have the resistance of like, I don't, like if people haven't really bought into the method, it's going to be really hard. So some of my clients immediately are like, that makes sense. I'm going to try because I'm so ready to beat the OCD, because typically OCD has a very high level of like pain, right? Like suffering is very high. So people that come into my practice are typically, and I'm sure you experience the same thing, Lauren, are very motivated for change.
Yeah.
So they're, as you know, I'm proposing this really, it seems like risky, reckless strategy, but most of them are very motivated, very, very motivated to get rid of the OCD. All the patients I've worked with so far have at least been willing to give it a try. As they come back in the next session, they will report back to me and we kind of go through, you know, the scenarios where their OCD got triggered. How do they respond? And if they did comply, if they did engage with the OCD, I ask them, and we kind of talk about, what was it that kept you from disengaging from the OCD? And oftentimes what I hear them say is, well, I wasn't sure if it was my OCD, right? Because it's like, in and of itself, it's like your OCD might say, well, what if this isn't your OCD? What if this is actually, like sometimes like, what if this is like God telling me I need to go to confession, right? Which is tricky, which we can talk about here in a minute. So the very first step that I work on with my patients is to help them learn how to identify what's OCD, when is it my scrupulosity? Because if they can identify it and name it, then they can say, okay, this is what I do when my OCD strikes. And so that's going to be the first step, like helping them see that the method works, convincing them that it works. And usually once they start seeing the first fruits, like if they start using it, usually pretty quickly, their OCD will start to become less and less, a little bit less intense. And so they see, oh, this does work, right? But then also having them learn to identify their OCD, which typically you'll get better at identifying it the more you practice, the more you kind of become aware of it. And some telltale signs of that are the urgency that we were talking about earlier. Do I feel like I can't even wait 30 seconds? Does waiting 30 seconds to think about this or to do the action or the ritual feel excruciating? If you have that sense of urgency, that's a pretty good telltale sign. Also, if you have those like accusing words, very like putting down, all those kind of words are typically your OCD.
Yeah. What would you say to somebody who they come in and you've been working with them for a little while and they begin to sort of like demonize their OCD. They see it as like this very flawed part of themselves. And I know this is more like identity work. So we're getting into a little bit of like, this is partly identity too, that we're bringing in here when I ask this question. But yeah, what would you say to somebody who like, they see their OCD as the problem and they're very overwhelmed by it as a concept or as a disorder? What's something that you might?
Oh, interesting. Well, if they come and say, I think the OCD is the problem, I would agree with them.
Yeah, sure.
I would say, yes, exactly. I would tell them, as we talk about like your OCD, we'll say, that's pretty intentional language, right? Like kind of like personifying it can help to get a bit of distance between you and the OCD. I mean, obviously, right? We're not saying that you're hearing voices or there's something in your head. It's obviously coming from your brain, but it's something that's not really congruent with your values and your truth. That's why actually a lot of times when the OCD starts to go down with my patients, I will hear them say, I feel like myself. Like they will have moments where the scrupulosity is not there or it's very quiet and they say, I feel like myself. And so that's why like personifying it and saying like the OCD's the problem. You mentioned the bully. I think that's a really, really good reference there. It is like a bully, right?
Yeah.
So that's what I would say. I've never actually had a patient be very overwhelmed by the concept of OCD to the point where it interfered with treatment. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.
So I think one of the things that I think about is when a diagnosis interferes with treatment. I worked under a psychiatrist for years, and a number of patients that I saw there had comorbid disorders. So we're not just talking about OCD, we're also talking about other things. But when I would run into interference where somebody felt like this OCD is ruining my life, it's going to ruin my life for the rest of my life because I'm going to have it. I hate it. It's always going to be a part of me. It always comes around when I feel anxious or I'm in a really difficult time.
I see.
This is a time when I might really talk to them about how the OCD is not like your enemy. It's not, neither is it your friend. It's something that exists in essence to keep you safe. And we can acknowledge that that's a good desire on some level. It's in overdrive. So we might look at like, we might do some psychoeducation about like, and you said that you would do that. You do that typically with your patients when they come in and you diagnose them with OCD. You might spend a whole hour session talking about this kind of thing. But really, I do think it's important just to acknowledge like when people hear like, oh my gosh, I'm exhibiting all of those symptoms of OCD. Oh, my OCD is horrible. And I'm going to have this for the rest of my life. Like the fear of like, I'm going to have this bully in my brain. And while I do say anxiety is a bully, if you let it bully you, it will take over your life and it'll take over more and more of it. The point here that I'm making is like, especially with intrusive thoughts, people become so anxious about their intrusive thoughts. They're like, I just thought about, I'm going to give some extreme examples here. So, but people will say like, I just pictured the priest naked, or and I want to be clear about these because like, I hope this doesn't scandalize anyone, but the reality is like, these are real terrors that people are living with. And so I do want to be explicit about like, these are some things that like, maybe you are struggling with. They might think about like pornographic content that they don't want to envision, or they might think about hurting or killing someone. And they know that these things are sinful and well, I want to be clear, they would be sinful to do. Just having an intrusive thought is not a sin.
Right. Yeah.
But the point that I'm making here is like, if you demonize your OCD, those kinds of things can escalate and feel really, really big and scary, because it's like, how am I ever going to escape the tyrant of this thing in my brain? Yeah. And so one of the things that I teach people is like, it's just a thought.
Yeah.
And that's all OCD. Like, it's just a thought that is there to try and protect you. But you know what? It's unhelpful. And often I'll have people thank it. I'll just be like, thanks OCD for trying to alert me to a potential danger. There's no danger here. And I want to also talk about how, like, when you're talking about intrusive thoughts, especially if you're talking about, like, some people have, like, for example, pedophilia OCD. The reason that the intrusive thought is so distorted, and so, like, what I mean by distorted is sick or disturbing. The reason that it is because it's your body it's your brain picking the worst, scariest thing it can think of to animate you into some kind of compulsion. So that's why when you're having the intrusive thoughts, they're like the most disturbing thing you've ever thought of. It's because your brain is like, what's gonna disturb my person the most to animate them into action so that it can save their life. So I really want to just not demonize it, because I think that sometimes when it gets that way, it can feel like people are like, what if I have these kinds of thoughts for the rest of my life? It's like, okay. Yeah. They're just thoughts.
Yeah. Oh, that's so good, Lauren. I'm so glad that you're touching on this. Yes. What you were saying of the OCD is just thoughts. I think that's a really important point to make, is that thoughts don't always point to the truth, right? Just because you have a thought doesn't mean that that's congruent with what you want or your values. It's like you were saying, Lauren, it's like your brain trying to figure out, how can I get my person's, I like how you said that, how can I get my person's attention? And usually it's with something like horrific. That is really hard to like not focus on. That's one thing that I usually get to with patients once they've like their OCD calms down. I like to look at, what is the purpose of your scrupulosity, of your OCD? And actually, I think, Lauren, we should probably make a whole episode about that. What is the purpose of your OCD? Because it really is trying to fight something off. It's trying to protect you from something, like you were saying. I sometimes like to tell my clients, it's like that friend who's trying to be really helpful, but in the meantime, like, makes everything worse. And it's just like the elephant in the porcelain shop. And it's trying to be like, look over here, don't look at this other thing that I think is really scary for you. And that thing that's really scary for you could be anything like a memory, an experience, a trauma that your brain is trying to protect you from. So really, I agree with what you're saying, Lauren. The OCD it's trying to be your friend in a very unhelpful way, in a very dysfunctional way. But the other thing I always tell my clients, to give them hope, is that usually, in my experience, the patients that come to me with OCD have some of the more higher like suffering and like pain level. But if they use the skills and tools that we teach them, their progress is typically pretty quick. Like, the symptoms actually go down surprisingly fast.
Yeah.
Don't think that you're going to have to use these skills, these tools, this being reckless, and I'm going to sit with this for 30 seconds and it's really hard for forever, because you are retraining your brain to actually calm down that inner alarm system. So actually, with time, the urges are going to become way less intense. Your brain is going to send you those signals less intensely, less frequently, and you're going to be more confident in knowing that this is just a thought and I don't need to comply. They're just thought. It's just noise, right? Your brain is so noisy. There's always thoughts, and some thoughts are relevant and others aren't. And if you catch on to those thoughts that are not relevant but very disturbing, that's when you get that snowball effect of like obsessing about them. But absolutely, if you're in that boat of feeling defeated by your OCD, like, we're here to tell you, like, we've seen it over and over again, that like OCD is actually very treatable. Would you agree?
Yes.
It's one of the diagnoses where typically we see progress pretty quickly. And it is, again, right, like, you start level 10 up here. It's hard to do, but the fruits come pretty quickly usually. Yep. And I would say, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this, Lauren, but I would say OCD is one of those things, kind of like depression. It's like, if your brain is prone to having OCD or depression or any of those kind of disorders, it's probably something that you're going to sort of have to deal with throughout your whole life. but not as intense as it is right now, right? Like it might, whenever your stress increases a bit, you might have a bit more scrupulous thoughts, or you might feel a bit more uncomfortable after confession, or have more intrusive thoughts that are harder to shake. But they're going to be less intense when they come, and you're going to know exactly what to do so that they like disappear again. One analogy that I like to use with my clients is the mosquito-bite analogy.
No, I don't know it.
It's basically, I tell my clients, imagine your OCD like a mosquito bite and the urge is to scratch, right? All of us know we shouldn't scratch it, not only because it'll make it infected or aggravated more, but it's also not actually going to make it stop itching, right?
It actually makes it worse.
It makes it worse.
Yeah, it's a great
analogy. Do we still itch? Yes, right? Right? We scratch the itch because we want to relieve the discomfort, even though we know it's going to come back, right?
Yeah.
We do it anyway. And the more we scratch, the more it itches. What is the best and fastest way to make the mosquito bite stop itching? We don't touch it. We don't do anything about it. We just leave it. What happens when we stop scratching? The itching becomes worse. At first, right? The discomfort increases and becomes really, really bad. That's when it's the hardest, right? Those first 5 seconds when we're not scratching, that's when it's the hardest to resist. The longer we wait and don't scratch, it becomes less and less itchy. It becomes easier to resist it. And the more we do that, right? If we actually don't scratch it at all, it actually heals a lot quicker than if we scratch. It'll itch for more days. So that's kind of an analogy I like to use to explain in very simple ways, right?
I love that.
Yeah. So like not scratching your mosquito bite.
That's really smart. You touched on ways to treat OCD. You talked a little bit about that. So I talked about exposure response therapy, but I know that in the past you've mentioned that you often use CBT. So will you explain a little bit like how you might with CBT, like what does that look like?
Yeah. Well, the first thing that I would say is kind of what I touched on earlier of using the powerful phrase, I'm not going to answer the question, because what we want to do with the CBT method, what it kind of aims at is disengaging, to not engage. And that means even not affirming myself and saying, I went to confession and God says he forgave my sins and the priest told me my sins were forgiven, go in peace. So I'm okay. Because that's already engaging, because your OCD is going to pick that apart. It's going to say, but how can you be sure? What about this? What about that? Maybe he wasn't paying attention. The more you try to affirm yourself, the more your OCD is going to get that sliver of doubt in.
Yeah.
And so the point is to not engage at all, to not answer any of its questions, to not engage at all. And you might have to say that sentence, I'm not going to answer that question 100 times. So that would be the first thing. And then the next thing is resisting the urge to seek reassurance. That's a big one. Seeking reassurance can look like going to talk to a priest and saying, did I say that right? Or seeking reassurance could be like going and like saying confession again to like get the reassurance, okay, my sins are really forgiven. Asking friends and family. Googling is a big one that I see. Googling, like, how do I know if I committed a mortal sin? Do people sometimes forget that they committed a mortal sin? All those sorts of things. Because every time we seek reassurance, again, we're scratching with the mosquito bite, we're engaging with the OCD, and we're giving our brain the feedback that says, this is relevant, this is dangerous, and our brain will then send those thoughts and signals more because it's trying to protect us, right? And we're feeding the OCD, basically. So that would be the second thing. The third thing, which is kind of like a very powerful tool, but typically people need to practice the other ones first before they get there, is to do the opposite. Yeah. Right? So basically when your scrupulosity tells you need to go back to confession, you don't. Or when you're sitting at church and on Sundays and your scrupulosity tells you, what if you committed a mortal sin? You shouldn't go receive communion, right? Again, with your OCD might tell you, but what if this is not your OCD? If you have that sense of urgency and a great anxiety, that's probably your OCD. Yeah. And the thing is, if you really feel like you shouldn't receive communion and you're making that decision from a place of peace and like your own free will, by all means do that. I think there can be very valid reasons to not receive communion. Right. So we're not saying like never not receive communion. There can be very good reasons not to receive communion on a given day, but it should come out of like a free will, right? Like your own decision. Because whenever you comply with your OCD, you're not free,
Right.
right? You're not making that decision because you think it's the right decision. You're making that decision. You're not receiving communion because you don't want to feel the discomfort. And that's not what should be guiding your decisions. So those are the three. I'm not going to answer the question. Do not seek reassurance, and do the opposite. So that's kind of in a nutshell the CBT strategy that I use with my patients.
Lovely.
What would you say? Maybe someone is watching this who's a priest, or maybe like a spiritual director caring for people in their parish, and they have someone that has these kind of questions, anxieties, seeks that kind of reassurance over and over again, or maybe a priest finds that a parishioner goes to confession multiple times in one day. What do you think would you tell them to respond well and to help that person?
Oh man, it's a really great question. Well, so first of all, obviously like a priest and a spiritual director cannot diagnose someone with spiritual OCD or scrupulosity, but they can have a good radar for it, especially if they've been in their professions for a period of time. And that might be a time to let whoever you're working with, or if you're a priest in the confessional, know like, I've been recognizing that it seems like you feel really anxious about this kind of thing. I might recommend that you go and see a therapist, a psychotherapist, about what seems to be OCD, spiritual OCD. And you might take a little bit of time to like explain what that even is, but basically these are not issues that people often find a way to solve on their own. I'm not condemning anyone to, imprisonment if they don't go to see a psychotherapist for this, but really having a psychotherapist alongside you helps dramatically. And also, there are other resources that priests and spiritual directors can recommend. I know I was once told by a patient actually who had spiritual OCD that they utilized a website called Scrupulous Anonymous. So it's like AA, and there are 12 steps for scrupulosity.
Oh. We can leave that resource link in the show notes.
Yes, we will. But so that can be really, really helpful. They might recommend like, hey, I know this website, and maybe you take a look at it, and if you identify with the things on this website, there are some recommendations. So I know that I believe the priest's name is Father Santa. I could be totally wrong, but I think Father Santa recommends that you have a psychotherapist and that you have a spiritual director who's schooled in scrupulosity. One of the issues that people run into in religious circles is that sometimes people in positions of authority also have rigid, and I'm not accusing anyone, but like they also have, more rigid concepts of faith, and there's a spectrum, and it's often based on personality. And so I think being if you are a priest or a spiritual director, being careful just to recognize like when somebody really is struggling with scrupulosity, it's not a good thing. Like it's nothing to be praised. In this case, going above and beyond is detrimental to this person's literal well-being.
Yeah. Oh, that's so good.
So that's what I might say.
Yeah. That's so good, Lauren. What would you say to someone? Like, have you had this happen that a patient comes to you and says, when they have those scrupulous thoughts, that they have the fear that, what if this is God speaking to me? What if this is God? Like, how can I say I'm not going to answer the question to God? What if I'm missing something? Like, God is telling me this thing, and if I don't do it, I'll go to hell. Like, what would you say to them? How do you handle that?
I would say there's never a time when the Holy Spirit is going to accuse and condemn you. Like, we know that the Holy Spirit moves in peace. He's the advocate. He's the paraclete. He's our defender. So when you notice that, rather than feeling like we can feel chastised by God, that's a good and healthy thing. But there's a difference between being chastised by a loving Father and feeling like, if I don't do this by an act of my own will, right? Like, if I don't, by an act of my own will, save myself, I'm going to hell. Well, okay, well, this is antithetical to Christian belief. we cannot get to heaven on our own. And I think that that's actually part of what OCD preys on and why it works so well with faith, especially like, you know, with the Catholic faith actually in particular, because of our views on salvation. People really will be like, but I don't know. There's no assurity, like there's no assurance in my salvation. And it's like, yes, but we also trust. Yeah. And so when you're missing that, like this huge pillar that should be supporting your entire faith life, which is the trust in a loving God, that's just not that's how you know it's not the voice of the Holy Spirit. Like he might convict and chastise us, but like with hope and trust that he's going to rescue us, not that we need to rescue ourselves.
Yeah. Oh, that's so good. That's a really good point you make, Lauren, about the only reason why these scrupulous thoughts can be is because they're rooted on, I have to be good enough. I have to do things a certain way in order to be saved. Whereas actually, we can't save ourselves, like you were saying. And we trust. I agree with you, Lauren. I firmly believe that God does not speak to us through anxiety, through threats, through accusing. I mean, who is the accuser, right? That's Satan, like the accuser. And a lot of these scrupulous thoughts are very accusing. Like, it'll be all your fault, is something I hear often patients say. If you don't do this, it'll be all your fault. If you don't do a better confession, it'll be all your fault. It's very accusing. That's not how God speaks to us, right? God invites. And yes, he does challenge, right? Like, we're not speaking about like a softy God who, never challenges or, like speaks strong words of truth. But it never comes from a place of accusing, or condemning, and anxiety. That's not how God.
Or like, you better get it together.
Yes, right.
It's like, I love you. Let me save you.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Right. God wants us to choose for him, not because OCD and anxiety make us unfree. So if we choose for God because we're so anxious, that's not free. That's not love, right? You can't coerce someone into true love. And God wants you to truly love him freely out of your free will. So he's never going to do that with the means of anxiety or coercion. That's the evil one. Hiding behind, and I think, like you were saying, I think that's why scrupulosity, especially in Christianity, is so prevalent, because it hides behind this notion of, well, you want to be holy, right? And therefore you must be better. So it hides behind this, right? Going to confession is a good thing. Not receiving communion after you've committed a mortal sin is a good thing.
Right.
The scrupulosity is using these good things to force us into compliance. And to keep us in compliance by hiding behind, this is a good intention, right?
I have like kind of a topic change.
Okay.
I mean, it's still about OCD and scrupulosity, but I am curious, have you had any patients come in with scrupulosity, but they are not Christian? Or have you ever had anyone come in who has OCD and they begin to look into spirituality? And what kinds of like things have you observed? And,
that's so interesting. Yeah. I definitely have had and have patients who have OCD who are not Christian. I guess one big difference is that they wouldn't be scrupulous around sin. That would be something that they wouldn't be, that their brain would even go to. They would just obsess about different things. In general, though, the method that I use will be quite similar. And I sometimes even feel, because so all OCD thoughts are going to be around things that are like very, that are potentially dangerous, like going to hell. The worst.
The literal worst.
What if I didn't lock the doorknob and somebody would break in and steal everything or kill me, right? That's pretty bad too. What if like I'm driving in my car? What if I hit that pedestrian? Also very terrifying. I sometimes feel like though scrupulosity is a little bit special in that it is almost the worst, because it's something, it's one thing to have something terrible happen in this life. It's another for your eternal soul to be threatened.
Yeah.
Right? I wonder if someone who's not Christian would think that way, because maybe to them, this life ends with death. And so everything that happens in this life is kind of, that's it. That's like the eternal, that's for them. That's like as far as like eternity goes. But for Christians, if their scrupulosity hooks onto, well, your eternal soul, is in danger, well, then everything's lost. I mean, that's almost even worse. Not almost. That is worse.
It's the worst.
The worst. So it's very hard to resist the scrupulous thoughts because you're running the risk of losing. I mean, it feels, right? You're not actually running the risk of losing your soul, but it feels. Your brain is so convinced that if you don't comply with the OCD, well, it's pretending like it's not your OCD, right? If you don't comply with the thoughts and perform the actions it's asking you to perform, you're running the risk of losing your soul.
Right.
And so it's very scary. The discomfort is very high. The anxiety it's very terrifying, which makes the scrupulosity especially, I think, painful for people. Would you agree?
I would. Yeah. I have worked with patients who are not Christian and have scrupulosity. Mm-hmm. One of the things that I've observed, and I talk to almost all of my OCD patients about this who begin to look into spirituality, and that is, there is one form of religious practice in particular that I dissuade anyone who I'm working with and has OCD from doing, and that is manifesting. OCD and manifesting manifesting, in my opinion, is actually a form of spiritual OCD. It's now taken the form of, it's a very popular, if you don't know what it is, it's essentially a very popular spiritual practice where people decide that something's going to happen to them. They meditate on this good thing happening to them, and then they observe that that thing like really happens in real life. The reason that I think OCD in particular, this is a detrimental spiritual practice to OCD in particular, is that it will literally just become an obsession, and then it will become a compulsive act to manifest. And the problem with OCD is that the underlying assumption is that you have more control than you actually do, which is, by the way, very this. I'm saying this because it is important to recognize it's the same concept that's going on in scrupulosity. You actually aren't in control. Let me just say this. You are not in control and never will be of whether you are going to heaven or hell. Like, you are not in control of that. Let that go. It's okay that you're a human. It's okay that you're struggling with this. It's a disorder. Jesus is going to save you if you surrender yourself to him and you trust him.
Well, we hope you enjoyed this episode on scrupulosity. Leave us a like and a comment below if you have any other topics that you would like us to talk about. And until next time, God bless you and have a good day.
Yes, this is it. That's it. It's a cultural question.
We got it.
Okay, praise.
Okay, praise? Did you say praise?
Yeah, praise.
Praise God.